Hello and welcome to my summary and commentary on part 11 of the introduction to Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. This is an important section to me for two reasons. First, we get Spengler's first unabashed criticism of Goethe, and that's going to be very interesting to delve into. And then next, and more importantly, at the very end of the section, we get a very deep insight into Spengler's philosophy and his theory of history. So let's dig in. So the first point is that he continues to criticize both the matter-of-fact school, which he also calls the Materialists, and the Romanticist school, which he also calls the Ideologues. So he says both sides of this debate are still fixed on causality, and this is going to be very important with his distinction between causation and destiny, causality and destiny, which is not a distinction that a lot of thinkers have, and certainly is a very foreign distinction for any English speaker. Even when I want to speak about his concept of destiny, it's very difficult not to use causal language because, well, I mean, and even here's this because in my sentence. I mean, it's very, very difficult to not think about these sort of matters in a causal way. And perhaps that shows that Spengler's attempt to speak of them in terms of destiny rather than causality is perhaps a vain attempt, but you be the judge. So next, he speaks more about the ideologues, the Romanticists, and he says Petrarch was a forebear of the Romanticists, and we've already seen him discuss Petrarch, a great medieval, well, I guess he did some archaeology. I'm not super familiar with his work, but he's right up there with Dante and Giovanni Boccaccio as the great Italian early Renaissance figures. And he also speaks that this Romanticist feeling, this is what created Florence, this is what created Weimar, this is what creates Western classicism. So this fetishization of the classical, this real, well, yeah, I guess that's the best way, I think, to put it in Spengler's conception. And I tend to agree with him here because, asking my own heart, subjectively, I have certainly fetishized the classical. I just love the Greco-Roman, so that's just how it is. And now he says the Materialists, on the other hand, they only appear in the mid-18th century with the rise of megalopolitan civilization, as he calls it. So this megalopolitan phase, this is right in the winter of the culture, or the late fall, and that's, obviously, these are metaphorical terms rather than strictly precise terms. But, the megalopolitan, so these are Paris, London, Berlin, all these cities, and he really views them as a big symptom and a big harbinger of the decline of a culture and of the rise of the thing become, the dead thing, the civilization. And so you can see in Spengler, a very anti-urban impulse and a very kind of pro-bucolic or pro-rural impulse here. So now he says, the culture man, that's the Romanticist, and this is in juxtaposition with the civilization man, the materialist, and there's a deep essential chasm between them. The civilized man just thinks in terms of economics and legal sources and, these kind of base ideas of how you make money and how you subsist. Whereas the Romanticist, the culture man, he's much more concerned with the artistic, the religious, the poetic. But Spengler says, in some sense, they are similar because they're both still causalists. They're both still fixed on causality, as opposed to his concept of destiny. And he says, all the West's finest minds abdicate the function of unrestricted criticism in reverence to the classical. And I think this is a very good point. This is one of, his points that I like the best. We do kind of certainly any object or person or, broader phenomenon that we admire or adore, we do suspend our function of unrestricted criticism. Even the best philosopher, even the keenest intellect will. So I think this rings true. And he says there's no analogous case of one culture making a passionate cult of the memory of another. And I think that's a beautiful sentiment and also rings very much true. And he says that the West has sacrificed the purity and independence of our art on the classical altar. And this also rings true, particularly with his conception of the Renaissance. As we've already encountered in some prior sections of this introduction, he views the Renaissance quite unfavorably. And he views this as trying to recapitulate the classical and in this way kind of stunting the growth of the Western soul itself. Although he doesn't believe the Western soul is particularly stunted. In terms of one culture stunting the growth of another, he views this in kind of a plant-like way, as where a big tree that's taking up a lot of, that has a lot of foliage in this upper canopy is taking all the light. So now this new, younger culture can't develop as much as it would. And he thinks that happened to a large degree with the Magian culture, which is synonymous with the Arabian. In his terminology, quite technically, we would say it's the Arabian culture and the Magian soul, the Western culture and the Faustian soul, the classical culture and the Apollonian soul. So another example of this might be American neoclassical architecture. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., or even a local little courthouse in the United States, these all have this neoclassical style. They look like they could be Roman in a sense. I'm sure there's differences with a true, authentic Roman building. But you look at the Lincoln Memorial and things like that, they're built to look like a Roman temple. And, to some degree, what does that actually stunt the American architectural style to the extent one exists? I mean, obviously, many Europeans or Asians would like to speak very derisively about any sort of cultural artifacts from the United States. I let you be the judge. So he says, finally, for this section, that this most fateful illusion, and this fateful illusion is our illusion that we're just a linear progression building off of the classical, and that, our concepts are the same as their concepts, perhaps just more refined. He would reject that totally. And he says this most fateful illusion needs to be looked into by a great psychologist. And once he's able to fully unwind why we have this illusion that we're connected to the classical so intimately, this would be very helpful for understanding the Western soul. On to the next point, he finally gives us some good criticism of Goethe here. So he criticizes Goethe's understanding of the classical soul. And he speaks about a fairly famous work from Goethe. When Goethe was in his late 30s, he went to Italy for a couple of years, and this was very common in those days, but particularly for younger nobility. You would probably do it in your late teens or early 20s if you were from Germany, England, maybe even France, and maybe even some other places. But if you're from Northern Europe, what you did was you went on what they call the Grand Tour, where you would go to Italy primarily, maybe to Greece as well, and you would just kind of soak up the great culture, all the ancient ruins and all of this. So Goethe, he does that in his late 30s, much later than normally would be done. And he wrote all this up in a fairly famous kind of, somewhat autobiographical. I haven't read it. It's in this big Goethe reader that I got, but I haven't dug into that yet. But, so it's called The Italian Journey, and it's fairly famous. I mean, maybe in the top 5 of Goethe's most famous works, but probably certainly within the top 10. And, but Spengler doesn't like it at all. He says, this is embarrassed and trivial. His comments on classical temples are embarrassed and trivial. And when the classical in its full force met him face to face, he did not recognize it. So this, I was very surprised reading this section again this morning in preparation for this discussion to see such a full-throated criticism of Goethe, because, I had kind of humorously said his axiom is Goethe is always right and Darwin is always wrong. Well, I guess that only applies to biology. And this is a good time to bring up the Gell-Mann amnesia effect. So I discussed this in my 5 reasons why you should read Oswald Spengler, which is not part of this series. That was a broader project, just more impressionistic, Here I'm really trying to focus on the text itself, and obviously I have my commentary, but I want to let you hear it straight from the horse's mouth, straight from Spengler himself, for the most part, but here I have to comment, because, Gell-Mann amnesia, this was noticed, it's a phenomenon named by Murray Gell-Mann, who was a great physicist of the 20th century here in America. He may have grown up in Europe, but I'm not sure. Murray Gell-Mann, it sounds like he's a Jewish guy who, was born in America. Because these guys with names like Murray and Sidney and things like that, those are usually the first generation, the first generation Jews to be born in America had all these kind of English names like this. That's very interesting. But so Murray Gell-Mann, he noticed that he would read a newspaper article about something he knew, so physics or some other topic. I'm sure he knew a lot about a lot of things. And he would say, this is so stupid. Like, they get the causal relationships completely backwards. Michael Crichton called this, these sorts of stories, wet streets make it rain. And you'll see this all the time if you read newspapers, which I don't. I will not read a newspaper. I do not watch cable news. Like, you got to tune that shit out if you want to be a real scholar in 2023. It's just a waste of time. Even to the extent it gives you any information, it's certainly a waste of time from your scholarship, unless your scholarship is investigating, I don't know, like, why the news media sucks so much. But Gell-Mann amnesia is the phenomenon where you read a newspaper article that you know about this topic, you realize they know nothing about this topic. They know absolutely zero, and they're just complete bullshit artists. And then you flip the page, and you forget. This is where the amnesia comes in. You forget that they knew nothing about the topic that you're actually an expert in. Or maybe not even an expert, that you actually know something about. And then on the very next page, you believe them when they're speaking about this other topic where you're less familiar with it. And I think that's exactly what's happening with Spengler and Goethe here. Because Spengler knows a lot about art history. I mean, this guy really knows art history. This is probably Spengler's strongest trait in the whole book is what he brings from art history. And I had never been interested in art history. I remember I had the chance to take an art history class when I was living in Xi'an, China, about 12 years ago now. 13 maybe, almost. Yeah, almost 13 now. Just 13. I was never big on art history, but Spengler got me much, much, much more interested in it. So he knows a ton about it, and he wields this evidence very well. And it's when Goethe's speaking about art history that Spengler has big criticism for him. But when it comes to biology, which, I mean, Spengler knows about as much about biology as, like, your 9-year-old cousin who's, like, in remedial math class. I mean, Spengler could not be more out of his depth when it comes to biology, and so he believes every single word of Goethe. And I was just reading my big volume of Goethe that I picked up, those collected works or selected works that I picked up the other week to because I care so much about you guys, the listeners. I want to educate myself about each and every aspect that I deem to be material to this project. And Goethe's understanding of biology and science generally is perhaps the most material aspect of this project that does not appear on the face of the pages of Volume 1 and Volume 2 of Decline of the West. Because Goethe's biological approach is the foundation for Spengler's comparative morphology of the high cultures. But Goethe himself, in this book, he admits that, like, nobody likes what I've done, and he tries to explain it away, and he's like, well, I mean, there's just these insufferable paragraphs where he's like, well, I hope I have made a good contribution to this science, and you're just like, dude, like, I'm so glad that you hope and that you're thankful for these other scientists who are actually doing great work in the field. Could you perhaps shut up about that and devote your energies to doing good science? But the fact is that Goethe's approach to biology is just mystical. Like, it's into the mystic when we're interacting with Goethe's biology. And I'm going to get into that more and more as we hear more about this guy. But this is what you've got to think, is Gell-Mann amnesia going on here? Because Spengler has very harsh criticism for Goethe, that he can't even recognize the classical when it meets him face to face. I mean, that's fairly insulting, especially for a guy that he idolizes in these other respects. But that's just because Spengler knows so much more about art history, whereas Spengler just is biologically illiterate. And his whole formation, his whole method is built off of his biological illiteracy, and the fact that he's trying to separate biology from physics and chemistry as a clean break, a clean dichotomy. No, world is nature. The way to look at physics and chemistry has no relation to biology or to history. That is Spengler's axiom. And even Goethe doesn't say this in one passage. So I don't want to be too insulting with Goethe because the biological, what do I want to say, the portrayal of Goethe as a biologist by Spengler is not that faithful. Because Goethe himself, even in the late 18th century, early 19th century, he's predicting that biochemistry is a field. Obviously, he doesn't use those words, but he's... there's some aspects of greater sophistication with respect to the relationship between biology, chemistry, and physics that Goethe shows than Spengler ever shows. So I don't want to, cast an unjustified calumny upon Goethe here, where it's really Spengler who's got the problem. Anyway, on to the third point. So they saved their inward image of the classical, all these romanticists, by choosing not to see the real thing. Again, they look at it, but they only see themselves. It's this philological mirror for the views they already possess. And they say they like ancient descriptions of megalopolitan filth, so Aristophanes talking about the filth of Athens and things like that. And they commend the state sense of the Romans, but hate these things in the modern world. And I thought this was a really good passage, so I'm going to just read it straight from the horse's mouth here. There is a type of scholar whose clarity of vision comes under some irresistible spell when it turns from a frock coat to a toga, from a British football ground to a Byzantine circus, from a transcontinental railway to a Roman road in the Alps, from a 30-knot destroyer to a trireme, from Prussian bayonets to Roman spears, nowadays even from a modern engineer's Suez Canal to that of a pharaoh. He would admit a steam engine as a symbol of human passion and an expression of intellectual force if it were Hero of Alexandria who invented it, not otherwise. To such, it seems blasphemous to talk of Roman central heating or bookkeeping in preference to the worship of the great mother of the gods. So that's his criticism of this romanticist fetishization of the classical. They can respect all these great practical, pragmatic accomplishments of the Romans, but they can't respect the same in 19th century and early 20th century Europe because, these Philistines, these economic men. So you probably certainly know the type in this day and age who would speak in such a manner. Anyway, on to the next point. He reiterates his criticism of the narrow-mindedness of each school. This is kind of a dead horse he's beating at this point, but we'll just move on from that. And then once again, he criticizes the empty buzzwords and the fact that, there's a lot of a nominalist in him here. So nominalism basically starts with William of Ockham. And this is just, it's a very, I don't really want to go into it. It's a very deep philosophical topic, but it was tremendously helpful in the growth of modern science. The nominalists helped pave the way with a lot of their skepticism toward Aristotelian causality, Aristotelian ideas about causes. He had the four causes. So the nominalists kind of saw through that and helped to develop science in a better way. Occam's razor's part of that, but only one part. So he says there's not the slightest inward correlation between the things meant by republic, freedom, property, and the like, between the Western and the classical. So this gets back to this apophatic abyss between the high cultures, this total abyss of knowledge. The Western cannot understand the classical, so don't try to do it, and not with your damn ancient medieval modern schemes. No, there is no linear history. It is only cyclical history. It is only the life cycle of each major high culture. So, dead horse continues to be beaten. And, but it is a good point. It is a good point. What we mean by republic is very different, even between France and the United States in the current age. For the United States, our republic is built upon structural principles. But in the aftermath of the French Revolution, where you have the Estates General, which are also built on structural principles, which I myself, particularly after my legal education, I think this is the correct way. Otherwise, you just have parchment rights. You need to create strong constituencies that can fight against each other. If there's only one strong institution and it's the state itself, the danger of demagoguery and tyranny grows greater by the day. Anyway, now he criticizes both these modern schools, the Romanticists and the Materialists, for hypocrisy and lack of candor. These materialist and romanticist historians. So he says, they make fun of these 18th century historians who honestly express their own political ideals in classical historical forms, but they cannot write a chapter without reflecting the party opinion of their morning paper. I love this. I mean, this is where I really love Spengler. Anytime he's going to speak contemptuously about party spirits and morning papers, I'm going to be all about that. Fuck the media. Fuck these parties. They're just such bullshit artists. And this is such a good point, because you'd much rather have these guys like the 18th century historians who honestly express their own political ideals in classical history forms. Just like me, right? Or not just like me. I'm not trying to arrogate that role to myself, but you can hear it when I'm speaking. I mean, I'm not trying to hide my opinions. I ask you to draw your own conclusions, and I try to present the arguments to you in the best form that I can, in the fairest way that I can, but I'm not trying to hide my opinions about anything. I don't do that. I don't hide. Okay? So I really respect these 18th century historians, and I hope that I can emulate them because they are actually honestly expressing their political ideas, rather than these, just hypocrites who cannot write a chapter without reflecting the party opinion of their morning paper. Brilliant. Just brilliant. On to the next point. He contrasts Don Quixote, and Sancho Panza. So Don Quixote, he's like their romanticist, spirit of chivalry, life as art, nobility. Nobility is a big concept with Spengler. He thinks the nobility is the class that really builds a culture. And I think he's got a lot of evidence to support that view. And on the other side, you've got Sancho Panza. So he's the down-to-earth, the practical, the materialist. And he says neither way leads to the end. Each school brings into high relief that part of the classical which best expresses its own views. So again, we see this selective marshalling of evidence. Each side, they like certain things about the classical, they all like certain things, but they're always selecting what's best for them. So, you can look at something like confirmation bias and things like that. And then he says, each school is just picking and choosing what it likes from the classical evidence. Nietzsche, the pre-Socratic Athens. The economists, the Hellenistic period. The politicians, Republican Rome. Poets, the imperial age. So if you're familiar with classical history, that probably will ring pretty true to you. I don't want to get down in the weeds on that. I'm trying to finish this episode for you all. And we're on to the most... this next point is by far the most important point of the whole video. So he says... There is no dependence, no priority, no relation of cause and effect between religious and artistic on the one hand, the things that the Romanticists would prize, the ideologues, and social and economic, the things that the Materialists, the matter-of-fact school, would prize on the other hand. No. There's no dependence, no priority, and no relation of cause and effect. This is a radical statement. And radically interesting, so let's discuss it a bit more. So what does this really mean? It means ontological priority here, and so I'm trying to avoid the word causal because he views these as destiny relationships. He doesn't view them as cause relationships. So ontological priority would... It's a difficult concept to discuss because it gets to the very deepest level of philosophy. So your ontology is central to your view of the world. For most modern people, they have a very materialist ontology. Material world is prior to everything else, right? Even God himself is just invented by man. And then on the other side, you have, a theist who would view God as prior to everything. And there's a lot of evidence from cosmology, the beginning of the universe, cosmogony. They call it cosmology today. I think they should call it cosmogony to a certain degree, but... Well, cosmology would be broader. The study of the cosmos. Cosmogony is the beginning of the cosmos. How did it develop? But the cosmogonical question, cosmological question, is really of huge interest because we can bring back the universe to when it's tiny, just with concepts of gravity, of general relativity. So this is how Einstein conceived of gravity. But once it gets tiny, now gravity doesn't have that effect. Now we're in the quantum world. So it gets really fucking crazy. So trying to understand why the universe exists, that's a huge ontological question. So I just bring this stuff up to kind of, give any listeners there who aren't familiar with this kind of abstruse Greek terminology that ontological priority. What I'm trying to say is what is the base? What is the first thing here? Okay? So he says ontological priority. He doesn't use this word, but this is how I'm interpreting it. I think the best term to use here is ontological priority. The rest of this is his quote. He says, ontological priority is determined simply by the greater or lesser purity of a historical fact's form, language, and symbolism. So this is what is truly important for him. The greater or lesser purity of any historical fact's form, language, and symbolism. And we've been acquainted with his ideas of form, language, and symbolism somewhat so far, but I must confess, I don't presume to fully understand what he means by these words, or if he really does have a single set definition for these words, or if there's some equivocation going on here with these words mean whatever he kind of needs them to mean in a certain section. But this is the foundation of his whole idea. This is his ontology right here. What is prior to everything else? It is the purity, the content of the purity. Is it great? Is it low? okay, of a historical fact's form, language, and symbolism. So this is all going to involve how it relates to the prime symbol of the culture, these prime religious symbols. So he really views the prime symbol, these fundamental religious ideas of a culture that are acted out through art, architecture, and everything else. He views these as the real ontologically prior, the causeless cause, the first mover, the unmoved mover to some degree. And this is foundational for his idea of historical destiny. And finally, he ends with a bit of an echo of Nietzsche here. He says, good and evil, high and low, useful and ideal, these are irrelevant to this inquiry. These are irrelevant to his historical project, to the understanding of how everything, how history works. I mean, just fundamentally, that's what it is. So he says, no cause and effect relation between religious and artistic and social and economic. This is radical. This, directly contradicts Marx, first and foremost, because Marx viewed everything of a culture as just being based out of the social and economic. And that wasn't a tremendously unique view in the 19th century, certainly not a tremendously unique view in 2023. And But Spengler rejects it, root and branch. I mean, he completely rejects it, lock, stock, and barrel, we could also say. And he views the thing that matters, these, both the religious, the artistic, the social, and economic, they're all secondary. They're all attendant phenomena. What is ontologically prior, what is the prime mover here, is kind of... It's just the purity or lack of purity of the form, language, and symbolism. So as we go on, we'll question this and we'll see how strong we think this is, but this is his view. So thanks very much for your time. I hope you have a wonderful day. I hope to speak to you soon, and thanks so much for your time. Peace.